What would you do if you had to exist side by side with the school's most notorious student? Well, that's a question Junyeong Yun can answer very well if you ask her. The story begins on a very bright and sunny school day. From a dreamy skyline view of the city, we are pulled over to the school, where a serious algebra class is in progress. Junyeong sat somewhere in the middle row, her eyes fixed on the profile of a male student a few rows ahead. His name was Na Seung-gun. She noticed he'd changed his hairstyle. Junyeong couldn't help but notice how noisy the class had been since morning. Her eyes trailed back to Seung-gun's profile again. He had a good-looking face. A uniform pair of eyes and nose, along with a mouth that suited this fair white skin like that of a wealthy person. As long as she'd known Na Seung-gun, he never really quite marched the rural and rustic setting of the countryside. Even in the discomfort, he proved how possible it was to be natural. Maybe it was because he was quiet and reserved. Junyeong could remember that he'd transferred to the school at a very uncertain time, and soon the popular prince of Gold Seoul University was able to get everyone to like him. While a whole story was playing in Junyeong's head, the teacher suddenly called out to Na Seung-gun and asked him to solve a problem on the board. Seung-gun tried his hands at it for a while before giving up. The question was too difficult. But his classmates didn't seem to agree, especially those with a particular distaste for his personality. One called him a punk who'd lied about covering the whole syllabus in his former school. But Seung-gun quickly explained that he hadn't solved the particular problem he'd been given. Besides, he'd been caught sleeping, and it was difficult to just solve a problem still feeling so disoriented. His classmates just thought he was a boastful rascal. They sniggered mockingly. The teacher was just about to get the class going forward when he suddenly turned to another student sitting right at the back. In Devil Kwon Beomjin, who apparently was causing some nuisance, and reminded him that it was the teacher who decided when the class was over. Beomjin simply told the teacher that he just needed to use the bathroom urgently in the most nonchalant manner possible, and he'd already unfastened his belt in the classroom. Everyone in the class moaned in disapproval at his apparently unsurprising behavior. Realizing he'd already lost the battle before he even got to fight, the teacher announced that the class was over. And guess who left the class before everyone else? Beomjin, of course. His classmates wondered what his problem was and concluded that he acted like a thug. The teacher asked the class to submit their homework to end the class finally, and afterwards, Na Seung-gun walked over to Junyeong Yun's desk to apologize to her. Because he couldn't solve the problem earlier, she'd been made to solve it. Junyeong merely spared him a mean side glare before asking him to get out of her way. Seung-gun was surprised by her hostility. Junyeong stated that she had to use the bathroom, but he was in her way. Upon learning that, Seung-gun apologized and backed away. Another classmate of theirs walked up to Seung-gun as Junyeong walked away and commented on how rude she'd been to him. Then she empathized with Seung-gun before advising him not to talk to Junyeong again. Seung-gun tried to explain that he wasn't offended, but he couldn't find the words. Junyeong could hear them the whole time, but she didn't even give them the benefit of a response. While she walked away, Junyeong heard the other girl ask Seung-gun if he didn't feel sleepy lately before she explained it away as a trick of the weather. Then she asked him if they could go out over the weekend. Junyeong eventually walked out of the classroom and her mind drifted to other things. Everything felt so tedious to her. Even her clothes were so worn out. Of course, it was normal with other people, but she believed she had it even worse than everyone else. The only person who was different was Na Seung-gun. Junyeong felt unlucky. In the countryside, whenever the sun set, the mountains became dark. Junyeong wasn't sure why she was climbing up the dark mountains and taking the rough path through it when she could have simply just followed the main road. At home, well, Junyeong didn't have a suitable learning environment, especially because there was no desk in the house. She could decide to stay at school and study, but the environment there was hardly any different from home. Either way, it was pointless to try studying in school. Even if it led to unnecessary arguments, Junyeong had no plans of standing out in the crowd. And then suddenly, she discovered something. A building along the mountain path. It was an old house that looked like a warehouse. Junyeong had stumbled on the place one day she'd run off after her drunk mother slapped her. The house was always quiet like a cave and felt even cool inside, despite the harsh summer heat outside. In her new hideout, she could study much better than at home or even at school. It was the best place she'd ever studied. The house was empty of furniture, but Junyeong didn't really need too much to study, just a desk where she could work comfortably. The inside of the house had telltale signs of life from its old owners, but it was obvious that they'd moved away some time ago. But none of that mattered to Junyeong. She was so happy to have a place to study in peace. Even more importantly, the house was empty. Until it wasn't. You see, as Junyeong held up her key to open the lock on the door just like she'd done every other day, she realized it was unlocked. But of course, she was aware of her fellow house squatter. He was the only person beside her who knew about the house. Kwon Beomjin. As Junyeong entered inside, Beomjin stretched casually with a yawn on the bunk in the corner. She didn't say a word to him, but he noticed her. Beomjin was the most notorious boy in the school. Scratch that. The most notorious in the whole neighborhood with an equally horrible reputation. Junyeong finally asked him why he didn't show up in school earlier, and Beomjin said he'd been bored, so he'd slept in. Junyeong waved it aside and moved over to her business. They settled into a bit of silence before Beomjin suddenly asked if she cared for some ramen. Junyeong declined his offer, but Beomjin was already moving to the cooker to fix the dish. He asked if she'd like some eggs, and Junyeong said he could, to make the food sweet just like the last time he'd made it. And they fell back into silence. Junyeong, from all indications, was sharing the abandoned house with the notorious guy in the neighborhood. Junyeong had known Beomjin for a very long time, so she was quite familiar with his story. He'd lost his parents when he was little and lived with relatives until he found their hideout, or sanctuary, whichever you'd like to call it. He'd moved into the neighborhood because he'd beat up his teacher at his old school. Beomjin came from a family of gangsters, and his parents had reportedly been stabbed to death. He was notorious for attacking elderly people at night. But of course, all these were just the rumors circulating around town about him. Even though they were in the same class in second year at school, Junyeong avoided Beomjin like the plague. She'd thought things would stay that way until they graduated. But fate had other plans. Barely a week after she'd stumbled on the abandoned house and made it her own little hideout, she'd heard a rustle in the corner while she was busy studying. She'd never ventured up the second floor of the building in all her time using it as her study campground. At the time, she'd assumed she was the only one in the house, but she'd been sorely mistaken. She looked up in the direction of the sound, and her eyes jammed with Beomjin's from his position on the bunk behind her. She screamed in horror. Then, Junyeong had launched into a long round of apologies. She'd had no idea it was his house because it was so empty and didn't have a lock, but she'd be on her way since she'd learned the truth. She knew the guy's reputation for being a troublemaker. Beomjin let out a very casual yawn while she yapped away without saying a word in response. She wondered how long he'd been in the room for, and why she'd had to be unfortunate to be in his house of all places. She figured she had to hurry and leave his house before things went south. But when Beomjin opened his mouth to speak, his next words rooted her in place. He calmly said the house wasn't his. Junyeong froze in shock before turning to him in disbelief. Beomjin casually explained that the place had been abandoned for over a month, and she was the first person to come around since then. Junyeong was surprised and asked if it was an abandoned house. Beomjin casually confirmed it was while he gulped down some water. Then she confronted him about what he was doing in the building, and he simply told her he'd just come in to sleep. Junyeong asked him what he meant, and he just went on with it as nonchalantly as possible and repeated himself. Then he asked her what she'd been imagining, and Junyeong reddened in embarrassment as she defensively denied his subtle accusation. He turned around to return to sleep since she'd only come around to study. Junyeong was surprised. She tried to appeal his decision to sweep everything under the bed, almost literally, but he didn't really care. He just went back to bed like she wasn't even there. Junyeong was confused. He just went back to bed? And worse still, she strained on her toes but couldn't see him. She wasn't comfortable with that at all. She considered leaving the house because she couldn't predict what Beomjin would do if she stayed back, whether or not he was asleep. But still, Junyeong had to study in the house as she had no other better options. Besides, Kwon Beomjin didn't exactly own the place, even though he'd found it first. But didn't that ultimately mean he could claim the place as his own? Junyeong battled silently with these thoughts until eventually, she took a brave decision to climb up the steps of the bunk. Beomjin really was just trying to get some sleep. But how did he know she'd come in to study? While she was hovering over him, his eyes darted open like a ghost's, and he asked if she had something to say to him. Junyeong jumped back with a start and let out a gurgling scream in fright. With the suddenness of her jump, Junyeong was sure to fall over the edge of the bunk. But Beomjin reached out and grabbed her arm just in time. He quickly pulled her back against his body, and Junyeong was stunned into silence. Beomjin asked her if she hadn't been on the second floor before. He explained that the railings were low on that part of the house and warned her to be careful. But all Junyeong could think of was the weight of his hand on her waist and the uncomfortable proximity of their bodies. Once she finally recovered from her shock, she pushed him away so violently. Then she asked him how he'd known she'd come to study in the house. Then Beomjin said he'd seen her the previous day. He'd woken up to find someone sitting at the desk and recognized her from the back of her head. So he just went back to sleep. Junyeong was surprised that he'd recognized her just by the back of her head. Kwon Beomjin explained to her that her seat was right in front of his. Junyeong was still doubtful that Beomjin could recognize people just by the back of their heads. While she was still in her thoughts, Beomjin told her that if she'd come in to use the bed, he'd have kicked her out. But obviously she'd just come for the desk in the corner, so he'd figured they could exist together. Junyeong was confused. Beomjin clarified by pointing out that they both needed a quiet place, and since they wanted different things, they wouldn't be disturbing each other. Junyeong reasoned that he wasn't exactly wrong, but something didn't still feel right. She asked him if he'd just come to sleep in the house, and he said yeah. Then she pointed out that he could have just used his own house, but Beomjin clapped by saying she could also study at her own house as well. Aura. For Aura. They both settled into a bit of silence, Junyeong feeling silly that Beomjin had a valid point. He'd meant he also had his own struggles just like she did. Junyeong asked again to be sure the house was abandoned since they'd be coming and going frequently. Beomjin suggested they'd need a lock and offered to bring one next time he was coming so they'd share the key. But Junyeong was still hesitant. She felt better using the place alone, so why should she consider sharing? Beomjin reiterated that they could coexist, but Junyeong was still not convinced. Beomjin asked her if she wanted the key, and she said yes. Then, without warning, he tossed her off the bed and asked her to go back down to her own space. The room fell silent again. As Junyeong went back to her desk, she couldn't help but wonder if she was doing the right thing. She looked up to the bunk and asked Beomjin if he knew who she was. He called her name without hesitation, and she paused in surprise. He didn't stop. She was in the school's rank 1 as well. He told her that simply because he didn't study, it didn't mean he couldn't memorize people's names. Junyeong knew she couldn't deny him quite the reputation for being a blockhead as well as a nuisance. So, she finally conceded to Beomjin's plans as she realized she didn't have many options to pick from anyway. The house was everything, and it wasn't a big deal after all. And that was how Yoon Junyoung and Kwon Beomjin started coexisting in an abandoned house along the old mountain path. All thanks to having their designated spaces, they'd had some peace since their little arrangement. Kwon Beomjin slept on the second floor while she did her studying on the first. Despite their arrangement in the abandoned house, they carried on like total strangers while at school. In both their defenses, they weren't supposed to know each other in the first place. As you'd expect, they didn't really talk much in the house initially, but when Beomjin brought her this wonderful dish of ramen noodles, Junyeong couldn't help but accept that they had to at least make small talk with each other. Bonding over a meal of ramen. Where in the world does food not work magic like that? Back to the present, and Beomjin brought over the pot of ramen he'd prepared. Junyeong asked how many eggs he'd put into the food, and then he told her he'd put 5, 3 of which were scrambled while 2 were left whole. Junyeong made a fuss about how she hated when the soup was thick and how 3 yolks mixed into the soup would definitely make it that way. Then Beomjin cut her off and told her point blank that cooking in one pot meant neither of them could satisfy their individual tastes. She'd have to settle with what she got. He handed her a lot of chopsticks, which she accepted grudgingly, and asked if there was anything he didn't like. But Beomjin just thought it was obvious she had a bad personality. While Beomjin was serving out some food for himself, Junyeong remarked that he was surprisingly sharp for someone with his reputation. And then, Beomjin did the unthinkable. He splashed ramen soup on her blouse. She paused briefly before launching into angry mode. But Beomjin continued eating his noodles with all the nonchalance in the world. He even asked her to go home, wash it, and then change into a different shirt. Junyeong whined in her mind about how she'd wanted to wear the bourse at least another day. She even wished she had a bigger fist, so she'd obliterate Beomjin for his atrocity. And then, unexpectedly, Beomjin set down his chopsticks on the desk and asked her to take it off so he'll wash it. Junyeong looked at him in shock and asked him what he wanted her to take off for him to wash. Beomjin casually pointed out that she had a stained shirt, and he was just simply telling her to take off her clothes. Junyeong couldn't have been more surprised. Junyeong jerked away from Beomjin, calling him a crazy bastard. She managed to bang her head on the wall, thanks to her sudden movement. Beomjin asked her if she had a habit of banging her head on things, and wondered if being super smart pissed Junyeong off so bad. Junyeong asked him to shut up through the throbbing pain in the back of her head. She was busy rubbing the pain soothingly when she heard the rustle of clothes and looked up at Beomjin. He was taking off his shirt. With shock written all over her face, she asked him what he was doing. Beomjin asked her to take off her shirt and wear his own since he was done eating. Junyeong asked him if he was being serious, but Beomjin ignored the obvious sarcasm in her voice and explained that he could get the stain on her shirt out with dish soap. Then he held out the shirt and asked her if she wanted him to wash hers or not. Junyeong looked at him in confused silence as she wondered if he really had to go so far. But the more she thought about it, she realized doing her laundry herself was a hassle, and the tap water was always good from morning to night. So if this meant she didn't have to go through the stress, it was worth it. But she had a condition. She snatched the shirt from his hand and asked him to go wait outside. Beomjin didn't have a problem with it and even slammed the door shut on his way out. Junyeong yelled in protest, but nothing would have changed anyway. After she was done swapping the shirts, she asked him to come back in. But when Beomjin opened the door, he observed Junyeong silently as she held the shirt up for him to take. She mistook his hesitation for a change of heart, but the big guy just took the shirt and warned her not to go about telling anyone he'd washed her shirt. Junyeong asked him what he was talking about, but he didn't offer any more explanations. He simply walked away, leaving her wondering why he'd suddenly stopped talking. While Beomjin washed the shirt, Junyeong observed him silently, chopsticks in hand, as she continued eating her ramen. She found it amusing that he was washing her shirt in the sink with his type of body. He had a really impressive physique. And he didn't have any tattoos like the rumors had carried around. His clothes also smelled nice. Of course, she couldn't help smelling the shirt. She realized he was nothing like she'd imagined initially. Unfortunately for Junyeong, Beomjin caught her smelling his shirt. How embarrassing. Junyeong quickly got into character and started flapping the shirt before her mouth like it was on fire. She complained about the ramen and asked how much pepper he'd put in it. Then she asked him for water to sell the act just well enough. Junyeong's face was red with embarrassment. Much later after the incident, Junyeong pushed her book away and stretched tiredly. She'd done enough studying for the day. As she got down to packing up her bag, she heard Beomjin stir from his sleep, followed by the sound of footsteps as he came down to the first floor. Beomjin always had a habit of waking up at the most unbelievable times. He asked her if she was going home, and she answered, "Yeah." Junyeong wondered if Beomjin had the senses of a cat to know if something was wrong around him. He offered her the shirt, and she received it from him. Junyeong had initially considered telling Beomjin that she was about to leave the house, but she'd ruled it off as pointless since he always woke up when she was about to leave. Beomjin asked her how she was going to get home since it was already dark outside. Junyeong was surprised. Was this tough guy worried about her? She asked him if he wanted to walk her home with a playful smirk on her face. Beomjin gave her a death stare and she immediately reconsidered her assumptions. She pulled out a small flashlight and said she'd be using it to light up the way. But Beomjin already knew that, and he advised her against walking around with the small flashlight. Junyeong was confused and asked why. Beomjin asked if she wanted the whole world to know where she was, because the flashlight would do just that. Junyeong sighed in realization and flipped the flashlight on his face. It looked pretty menacing, enough for her to put it off and ask how she'd get home if she couldn't use it. Beomjin wordlessly left her standing and went over to a drawer. Junyeong tried to find out what he was doing, but he didn't respond until he'd fished out a pretty scary stick. He walked back to her and she flinched in fright as she asked what he was doing. Who wouldn't have feared the worst in Junyeong's situation anyway? Junyeong feared she'd let her guard down and was paying the price. Kwon Beomjin was famous for being violent after all. Beomjin stopped just a few meters away from her and thrust the stick in her face. Junyeong flinched and shut her eyes in fear. But Beomjin simply handed her the baton and asked her to hold it and follow him, because he could see pretty well in the dark. Junyeong blinked hard in a mix of shock and disbelief. But she eventually held onto one end of the stick while he held the other. You see, Junyeong wouldn't have guessed that she'd be holding onto the stick every other day. Beomjin even went the extra mile to make a handle for the stick so she'd not have any splinter accidents. Time after time, Beomjin put up behaviors that made Junyeong second-guess the rumors she'd heard about him. Even as she followed him home in the dark, seeing nothing but his back, he served as her eyes. Junyeong suddenly remarked that he was just like a cat. His name even had Beom in it. And that literally translates to tiger. Junyeong kept talking about cats and how their vision was good because their pupils could dilate to see the tiniest bit of light. Beomjin noticed that she knew quite a lot of things. Junyeong suddenly asked if he slept in the abandoned house in the day like he did at night, and Beomjin asked if she was trying to find out how he spent his nights. She quickly answered with a bold no. Junyeong explained that she was only wondering what would happen if she came around the house one day and he wasn't there. How would she go home in the dark? Then Beomjin dropped the most obvious answer. She had to go home while the sun was still up. Junyeong mused the words aloud as she thought about it, but she knew it wasn't possible. He led her to the main road in silence, and once they got to a street lamp, he pulled his stick out of her hand and asked her to start walking home. He turned around almost immediately and began walking away. Junyeong meekly agreed to his instruction, but paused after a few steps to turn around and say thanks. Well, she thought about it, but one look at his retreating figure and she swallowed her words. She stared at him in confusion for a bit, before she eventually began walking away. She paused in front of the door to her house and looked down the stairs. The place was wide open and she could see stacks of beer bottles on the floor in the corner. Her mother had been drinking again. Junyeong hoped she was asleep as she gently let herself into the apartment, careful not to make any sound. But that was pretty pointless, because right there, waiting on the other side of the door in the middle of the kitchen, for absolutely no reason whatsoever, was her mother. And she looked pretty, well, drunk. Junyeong jumped with a start, surprised to find her mother awake. Without any warning, Junyeong's mother picked up a bowl of water from the kitchen sink and hurled it at her, on the same shirt Beomjin had washed earlier. Junyeong stared at the wet shirt in disbelief, but her mother wasn't done. She slapped Junyeong hard, but Junyeong's arms quickly flew in front of her face like a shield. Junyeong wished she'd come home a little later. At school the following day, the school's field was littered with students, all playing different games under clear morning skies. The place was pretty crowded, and Junyeong had to navigate through a sea of bodies as she walked by to join a game of dodgeball with other students. She spotted Kwon Beomjin from the corner of her eye, but of course their silent pact was still in place, so neither of them said a word to each other. Junyeong carelessly bumped into someone walking in the opposite direction. Oh Hyesu, from her class with Nasungun, and she was playing the same game. Hyesu apologized for not spotting her on time as she took full responsibility for the incident. Junyeong, in her nonchalant state, flashed the girl a middle finger. Hyesu launched into an angry fit, and Junyeong sarcastically asked if she could see her finger. Hyesu was about to pour out her rage on Junyeong when the sportsmaster stepped in and broke them up. Junyeong didn't usually let Oh Hyesu and her group of friends get to her, but with the incident from the previous night, she felt really terrible. She figured it was probably because she'd stayed out in the rain afterwards. Junyeong wondered if she'd caught a cold in the rain. Once the game started, the ball came in Junyeong's direction and she was about to catch it, but one of Hyesu's friends showed up from nowhere and swatted the thing out of her reach. Junyeong flinched at the girl's sudden appearance. The girl gave her a side glance before announcing that she was about to throw the ball. Junyeong wanted to let it slide and settle back into the game, but once the ball was coming her direction again, the girl jumped in the way and caught it like a super goalkeeper at the World Cup. Then she proceeded to throw it back and forth between her, Hyesu, and another girl. Junyeong merely observed them in confused silence as she wondered what they were up to. Then slowly it began to register in her mind that the girls were actually keeping the ball away from her on purpose. Were they trying to exclude her from the game? Because they seemed pretty excited about doing so as they flashed her side glares and mischievous smirks while making silly, threatening gestures at her. Junyeong just thought to herself that she'd rather have them hit her with the ball instead. Talk about empty threats. Seunggun was in the game as well. And as if she'd heard her thoughts, Oh Hyesu asked Seunggun if she could throw the ball. Her friend whispered to her that she thought it'd be cooler to push Junyeong to the corner. Junyeong caught wind of this and knew right away that things were just getting worse for her. She had to come up with an excuse real quick, like going to the nurse's office. While she was still contemplating, Seunggun let the ball go hard in the air. Hyesu jumped out of the way and it landed squarely in Junyeong's face. The sheer force and surprise of the impact sent Junyeong flying backwards and she collapsed on the court. The field was thrown into commotion as everyone let out a collective gasp of shock. When she remained unmoving on the floor, Seunggun screamed in alarm and ran over to her. Hyesu and her cronies tried to make it seem like Junyeong was just acting to be hurt, but it couldn't have mattered to Seunggun as he crouched down to the floor beside Junyeong and hoisted her up into his arms to the nurse's office. Beomjin was passing by the court when the incident occurred, but he couldn't have done anything to help anyway. When Junyeong opened her eyes again, she was in the sick bay. She'd fainted. Maybe she caught a cold out in the rain. She turned her head to the side and looked at the window. It was covered with a lot of papers and she wondered what they were. Before she could get her answer, the nurse entered the room and complained about the heat. Apparently, someone had brought in a heater in the middle of winter. Junyeong realized only then that she'd been feeling hot the whole time. Then the nurse's eyes went to the window where there was a cluster of various pamphlets, and she asked Junyeong if she was responsible for it. But Junyeong said she wasn't, and the nurse proceeded to rip them out one after the other as she complained about how much they were. The ripping noises only added to Junyeong's aching head. The nurse brought a hand to touch Junyeong's head as she asked if she was feeling better. Then she remarked that it was hard to tell whether Junyeong had fainted from heat exhaustion or a cold. She reasoned that Junyeong could have just simply told the PE teacher that she wasn't feeling well. But Junyeong said she thought she was going to be fine. The nurse was about to say something when she changed her mind and advised Junyeong to go home since classes were almost over for the day. She added that she had to attend a meeting, so Junyeong would have to take some medicine herself if she felt a fever coming on. Junyeong agreed calmly and helped herself into a sitting position on the bed. She knew it'd be impossible to rest at home, and she really needed it because of her aching head. While she was still weighing her odds, she heard the nurse's conversation with someone at the door. The nurse asked if they'd come to see Junyeong before ushering them in. She wondered who it was. Was there really someone in the school who wanted to check up on her? She figured if she was going to make a guess, it'd be Kwon Beomjin. But Seunggeun showed up instead. He peeled through the curtain, hiding her bed, and asked if she was up. Junyeong was still so startled by his visit that she couldn't give him a response. Why had he come? Of all people. She asked him what he wanted, and Seunggeun said he'd just come to check if she was okay, and he'd actually come between classes, but she'd still been asleep. He'd feared she might need to go to the hospital. He felt guilty because the ball that had hit her came from his hands. Junyeong looked at him like he was going crazy. She knew just as the nurse had confirmed that she'd collapsed because of the cold. But poor Seunggeun was all sad and guilty for the incident. Junyeong felt selfish for a moment and figured she finally had her opportunity to blame Seunggeun for everything. She asked him why he'd bothered to come when he'd thrown the ball with all his heart. Had he come to see if she was really hurt? Seunggeun turned to her with shock written all over his face as he began explaining. He'd noticed she wasn't looking well when she'd come to school earlier, and even during the game, she'd looked nervous. In fact, in his defense, she'd looked like she'd wanted to get hit to begin with. So poor Seunggeun had assumed she wanted to get hit and leave the game to rest. He was only just realizing how hard he'd thrown the ball in the bid to help her. He dropped his head in shame and apologized again. Junyeong looked at him without responding and wondered if a person could be so honest. She found it hard to apologize to people. Junyeong could only conclude that Na Seunggeun had enjoyed a life of warmth without a nasty pest that bothered him. She finally accepted Seunggeun's apology and said nothing felt broken in her body. Seunggeun was relieved, but that didn't last because Junyeong quickly told him that she'd gotten a bruise from the fall. Seunggeun almost had a panic attack. Junyeong knew the bruise hadn't been his fault either, but she was enjoying the sight of Seunggeun feeling guilty for everything. She tried getting up and he offered to help, but she told him she could do just fine by herself. Junyeong looked at the heater and figured Seunggeun had put it there. When she told him it had been too hot, he stuttered in embarrassment. But she appreciated him for the effort eventually, and also for covering up the window. That had to have been him. Seunggeun stood there in silence as she spoke and watched her as she began walking out of the room. Junyeong couldn't get her mind off how easy it had felt to say thank you. She suddenly lost her balance and was sure to fall again, but Seunggeun caught her and steadied her. He asked if she was okay and advised her against sharp movements in her state. Even though he had the purest intentions, Junyeong couldn't get her mind off how close their bodies were to each other. His body so close behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his head just over hers. As if he'd been summoned, the door to the sick bay slid open, and there in the doorway stood Kwon Beomjin. An air of awkward silence passed among the three. Beomjin looked at Junyeong and Seunggeun in silence, his face as unreadable as usual. It didn't help Junyeong's case that Seunggeun was standing so close to her, maybe a little too close. When she finally got a hold of herself, she yanked her arm away from Seunggeun's reach. Seunggeun, oblivious to the flying tension in the air, asked Beomjin if he was hurt and had come to see the nurse before offering that she'd just left. Beomjin stepped further into the room wordlessly, and for some reason, it gave Seunggeun the wrong idea to block Junyeong protectively. Junyeong wondered what was wrong with him. Did he think Kwon Beomjin was coming to hurt her? Well, in his defense, Beomjin did give off a scary vibe. But why had he come to the nurse's office anyway? Junyeong was pretty sure he'd not come because he was worried about her. She just couldn't picture him getting concerned about anyone else. Beomjin walked over to a cupboard in the corner, pulled out a drawer, and slipped out a pack of pills. Then, as silently as he'd walked into the room, he turned around and walked away. sliding the door shut behind him. Junyeong and Seunggun could only look on in a mix of confusion and surprise. Seunggun finally heaved a sigh of relief. Junyeong was still trying to get the rationale behind Beomjin's little display. He'd just walked into the room and changed the mood in the room like he wasn't the same person who'd offered to wash her clothes just because she'd glared at him. Seunggun confessed that he still felt a little awkward around Beomjin, and Junyeong agreed with him in her thoughts. But she wondered why Beomjin had come to make medicine. Was he sick? She made a mental note to ask him when she got to the abandoned house later. They carried on walking out of the room, and Seunggun suddenly remembered something. He was going to walk her back home. Junyeong froze in place, and while Seunggun was trying to explain, she brushed off his offer. Even Seunggun was surprised she'd given her response so quickly. Junyeong said she wouldn't be needing his company because she was fine. With that, she walked up to the door and let herself out. Seunggun could only watch her in silence. Junyeong couldn't let anyone find out about the situation at home. Later that day after school, she went up the mountain track to the abandoned house and met the door locked. Beomjin hadn't arrived yet. As she flopped her bag down on the desk to begin studying, Junyeong felt drained of all the strength in her body. But she still had to study whether or not she felt strong. She didn't have much time until her exams started. Maybe she was being stubborn, but Junyeong had vowed never to lose her first place to anyone until she graduated. Because it was a title she'd earned by her own ability. She couldn't give it up to anyone else, especially not in the kind of school she was attending. But as she tried studying, her eyes kept going up to the bunk on the second floor. She figured it just had to be the fatigue because she couldn't shake off the feeling of sleep that was constantly on her mind, and it felt like a slight fever was coming back. Junyeong figured sleeping for a while would help her feel better. She contemplated in her mind whether or not to just rest for a bit, but there was also the part of her that wanted her to forget about sleeping and concentrate. Ultimately, she gave up and found herself on the second floor. It was importantly to rest the body after all. Oh, and the bed was so soft. Junyeong momentarily wondered what Beomjin's reaction would be if he found her on his bed. She could picture him with his guiding stick, towering above her kneeling figure as he demanded to know why she'd been trespassing. Then her mind shifted to the events of the day. How she'd collapsed and then Beomjin's sudden appearance in the sickbay that had her so embarrassed. She wondered what he'd thought when he saw her and Seunggun together. His facial expression hadn't seemed like he'd been surprised or trying to tease her. But she also figured Kwon Beomjin wasn't the type of person to make any expressions at all, so it was hard to tell. Junyeong couldn't shake off the feeling that Beomjin was about to walk into the building at any second. She wondered if he'd wake her up when he came in. But then it suddenly occurred to her that she was clueless what to do if he didn't come. He'd made her stop carrying her flashlight with her to the house. All these thoughts swam in her head until she finally fell under the weight of sleep. Then the strangest thing happened. While she was asleep, someone came into the house and crouched over her on the bed. As Junyeong's eyes slowly fluttered open, she hazily became aware of the presence of the stranger and was instantly alarmed. She screamed and threw her fists in his face as she jolted upwards. But the stranger was faster and much stronger. He tried to calm her down before resorting to restraining her hands by the sides of her head. And this stranger somehow knew her name. Only then did Junyeong realize that it was no stranger but Kwon Beomjin. Beomjin, on the other hand, had initially assumed she was a stranger because she'd never climbed up his bed before while he was away. Immediately, she resumed thrashing around wildly to get him off her, flailing her arms blindly until Beomjin's back went straight up the ceiling with a bang. Then she stopped. Beomjin was furious. Junyeong asked him why he'd pinned her down. Beomjin argued that he'd thought she was some stranger who'd broken into the house. Junyeong fired back by saying he should have expected to see her in the house because only the both of them could access the building. Beomjin couldn't believe his ears. He was going to argue, but he reconsidered and waved it off. He thought she was crazy anyway, and asked what she was still doing in the building because apparently it was so late in the night. Junyeong said she couldn't have known what time it was because she'd been asleep the whole time. Then Beomjin told her it was already past 2 a.m. Junyeong paused in shock. Beomjin pointed out that she wasn't supposed to be in the building by that time, and even if she was, she should have at least locked the door. He asked her how insane she'd been to sleep in the house with no fear at all. Junyeong asked if he was an idiot and reminded him that she couldn't lock the door from inside. When he'd realized he didn't have a good comeback, he switched to saying that she should have slept at home. Junyeong wasn't exactly willing to back down. She told him to take his own advice and go sleep at his house. Why was he making a big deal out of everything when he was there in the house at the same time as she was? He'd been the one to say it was past 2 a.m. after all. Beomjin turned to her and stated that the second floor was out of bounds for her in the first place. Oh, Junyeong was so pissed. And she couldn't rein in the onslaught of words that she let out on Beomjin as a result. She asked why he was fussing over who owned where in the house, when she was only using the hat they'd both met inside the building. She'd been in pain and had a bad headache, and there was a bed which he wasn't even lying on at the time, so she simply climbed up and slept on it. She explained that she'd not been in the right frame of mind, thanks to her sickness. All the talking only made Junyeong's headache worse. She let out an angry scoff and announced that she was leaving. Beomjin could use the bed as much as he wanted, even for all eternity. Beomjin calmly stated that it was late, so he'd walk her home. But Junyeong wasn't having any of it. She wasn't about to take help from the same person who'd been ready to attack her only moments ago. Then Beomjin brought up the dodgeball incident from earlier in the day, and Junyeong froze on the spot. He'd seen her? She turned to look at him so abruptly, the big guy flinched with a start. Then he looked away in self-consciousness before he started fidgeting nervously with his hair. Junyeong could only watch in confusion. What was wrong with him? She also found it hard to believe he'd be worried for her, because she'd assumed he'd laugh at her for going out to court half asleep. After an eternity of silence, Beomjin asked about Junyeong's condition. Junyeong was caught unawares by his question. He asked her why she hadn't taken any medicine at the nurse's office, and she answered that she'd been asleep the whole day. But she felt a little better after resting. Beomjin asked her where her body hurt, and she answered that only some parts of it did, and she couldn't sleep well. She suspected she had a mild fever. Beomjin asked her to wait while he walked down the stairs. Junyeong wondered how he could see so clearly in the dark. It must be his cat eyes, because she couldn't even see anything herself. She warned he'd have a bad fall. Beomjin asked her why she was worrying about him when she was the fragile one. Junyeong quickly fired back and told him that she wasn't worried about anyone but herself who'd be the first witness to his death. And Beomjin said it was unfortunate that she felt that way. He hit the lights anyway, and Junyeong squinted in discomfort at the brightness of the light. She looked at Beomjin and realized he was bringing out the pills from earlier. She announced that she was going down the steps, but Beomjin asked her not to move since she was still dizzy. He handed her a tablet of medicine and a mug of water. Junyeong asked him if it was from the nurse's office. She also asked if he'd been injured as well. Beomjin jokingly said he'd been having cramps, and Junyeong felt stupid for asking. She asked him if he was joking, and he asked her to shut up and take her medicine. Then Junyeong burst out into laughter. Kwon Beomjin had period cramps. How hilarious! She wished she had a close friend she could run over to and tell. Beomjin mused that she must be proud of herself. Junyeong was still so consumed with laughter, and she really wished she'd found at least one friend. She carried on laughing for a while until she got tired. Beomjin asked her if she wasn't in any trouble at home. Junyeong asked why, and he pointed out that she'd not gone home even though it was so late. Junyeong wiped her lips and looked at him in silence before she admitted that she was going to stay in the house for the night. Beomjin looked at her in disbelief. Junyeong calmly said it was probably for the best, and Beomjin gave her a blank look in return. Then he asked her to get down from his bed. Junyeong advised him to stop sleeping so much. He even slept in school. Beomjin asked if she had the right to give him advice when she'd just slept so long herself. Junyeong retorted that she was talking about his daily habits, and hers was just a one-time situation. Beomjin asked her to stop nagging at him and go home already. But Junyeong disagreed and asked him to leave instead while she stayed. Beomjin asked why she was being stubborn. Why did she want to stay alone in the house so late in the night? Junyeong asked him who else came to the house besides him. Beomjin reminded her that the house once belonged to someone and that person could return anytime. It could even be right as they were speaking. Junyeong simply blurted that he should stay behind as well. Beomjin looked at her like she'd just spoken an abomination, and Junyeong quickly explained that she hadn't implied that they'd sleep together. Beomjin was just astounded by her sharp mouth. But Junyeong quickly reminded him that they both reached an agreement about why they needed the house. Beomjin quickly pointed out that the house was just for her to study in. Junyeong went silent for a while before finally admitting the truth. The house was the only place she could really find rest. Junyeong would never have imagined she'd be making such confessions to another person, but she figured that if she was sharing the house with Beomjin, then it was probably okay to say that much to him. She told him that she couldn't go home. Beomjin was in a bit of disbelief and confusion at once. But Junyeong knew that secretly, they both had the same reason for being in the house. Beomjin looked down to the floor below them in silence, and when that passed, he walked down the steps. He was going to let her use the house for the night. Junyeong called out a thank you to him, and he nearly staggered at the bottom of the steps. Junyeong quickly advised him to be careful going down the steps. He was so close to dying with just one misstep. He asked her to keep her voice down. He went down to the desk and settled down on the chair, slouching forward to put his head down on the desk. Junyeong stared at him in surprise before she finally called his name. Kwon Beomjin. He gave her a very weak response, and she asked him to turn the lights off. She'd called him just for that. The switch was on the first floor anyway, so it made sense. Beomjin obliged her request anyway and turned the lights off. As she closed her eyes, Junyeong felt comfortable, even in the strange house. The dawn was dark, but she didn't feel any fear, especially because Kwon Beomjin was downstairs. Junyeong couldn't help but wonder when Beomjin's presence started bringing her relief instead of danger. She turned around on her side and realized that the bed smelled faintly like Kwon Beomjin. She'd not noticed it earlier because she'd been passed out. It felt soft, but cool. Even though she knew because of his personality, he'd probably not use cologne. But he smelled nice anyway. In all, he was really different from how he looked. She remembered the period cramps and laughed about it. Beomjin asked her to go to sleep before he kicked her out of the house. By the following day, she woke up feeling better. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had such a sound sleep. Her fever was gone, her body didn't ache anymore, and she could already feel the freshness of the morning air. And there was something else? Was that breakfast? She peeked over the edge of the bunk and down to the first floor. Beomjin was busy making his specialty ramen noodles. Junyeong's face lit up in excitement. Junyeong was genuinely curious and wanted to know if Beomjin always made ramen in his house. He ignored her and spared her a little awkward glance before turning back to his cooking. Junyeong felt embarrassed. She gradually stepped down from the bed and sat on the first step. She asked Beomjin to turn off the light since she could see just fine, and he hit her with her own words. He said he didn't want to be the one to find her broken body on the floor. Junyeong scoffed in disappointment as she walked down the steps and said he would be more than a first witness if anything happened to her, because he'd be seen as a suspect. Beomjin found that hard to agree with. What would be his motive? Junyeong gave her best impression of Beomjin's nonchalance, as she assumed he'd say he couldn't stand to see her laying in his bed all day. She found her little act funny and laughed aloud. Beomjin wasn't really amused. In fact, he told her point blank that her joke was boring. Ouch. But Junyeong didn't back down and said it was better than anything he'd come up with. The ramen bubbled on the stove while they talked. Beomjin had cooked it with some green onions and red pepper powder, eggs, and dumplings. Junyeong took one glance at it and noticed he had broken the yolk into the soup. She'd asked him not to do that before. Beomjin held a hand over his nose and asked if she wasn't going to get a shower because she smelled of sweat. Junyeong sassily said she'd do that when she was done eating. Why was he even making a fuss about it anyway? Moments later, Junyeong settled to eat some of the food and could only sing Beomjin's praises while she ate. After their breakfast, Beomjin did the dishes. Junyeong sat with a glass of water as she reminisced about the taste of the food. She looked in the corner beside the sink and saw a towel. She asked if it belonged to Beomjin and if there was another. Beomjin said it was the only one. Without any warning, Junyeong snatched it off the counter and said she was borrowing it. She hung it over her shoulder and remarked that Beomjin wouldn't even have a problem if he didn't wash his head before going to school. No one would dare comment on it anyway. Beomjin casually agreed with her. Junyeong went on explaining how her hair felt gross and she needed to wash it. Beomjin asked why she thought anyone would notice. Was she worried Na Sungun would? Junyeong was caught off guard. When she eventually recovered from the shock, she asked him why Sungun would be interested in her hair. Beomjin stared at her briefly before turning back to what he'd been doing, as he asked if she really had no plans of going back home. Junyeong was sure she didn't want to do that. He pulled out a pot from the cupboard and put it under the kitchen sink to fill it. He told Junyeong that she'd have to heat the water up before showering with it because it was cold. He placed the pot on the stove anyway as she stared at him in surprise. Junyeong had noticed how sensitive Beomjin was being around her. She asked him to go up and sleep on the second floor while she washed up. He threw a jab at her by saying she must have sweated a lot and he couldn't sleep on the bed. Junyeong defensively said she hadn't sweated that much. Beomjin went over to the desk and sat down. He asked her to forget about him because he was going to sleep right there. Junyeong clicked her tongue at his nonchalance. Why did she even bother with him anyway? After showering, Junyeong returned to the first floor and found Beomjin fast asleep even in his sitting position. While she looked at him, she mused that Beomjin could actually threaten her school ranking if he put as much focus into studying as he did into sleep. For the first time, she wondered what his grades were even like. She'd left him at the abandoned house and gone to school. While she walked up to the entrance, she heard someone call her name and she paused to see who it was. Oh, Hyesu and her cronies with the most ridiculous smirks on their silly faces. Hyesu asked her if she was feeling all right, and Junyeong, with a shred of sarcasm, shot back and said it was all thanks to her. Hyesu didn't let the joke go, and mockingly remarked on how sad it was that Junyeong was looking extremely fine. All Junyeong could wonder was why these girls would just walk up to her so early in the morning to ask how she was feeling. It completely sucked. Hyesu cocked her head to the side and said she was really disappointed because she'd never expected Junyeong to do something so childish. Junyeong didn't understand what she meant by her statement. Hyesu said she couldn't believe that Junyeong had fainted in front of Sungun just to get his attention. She laughed at her and said she was super funny. Junyeong just stared at her in disappointed silence, like she'd just said all the words backwards. Then she finally asked why Hyesu would assume she wanted Sungun's attention. Hyesu thought it was ridiculous that Junyeong would ask her a question like that because it was so obvious that she liked Sungun. Junyeong froze at Hyesu's blind assumption. She couldn't even comprehend it right away. Hyesu started pointing out how she'd noticed that Junyeong couldn't stop staring at Sungun. Hadn't she changed her tactics by fainting since acting uninterested in him hadn't worked? She asked if Junyeong was embarrassed that she'd been caught. But for Junyeong, this was still news. She liked Sungun? Was that possible? It didn't even seem so. Whenever she looked at him, it was for a very different reason. His hair, his clothes, his bag, his accessories. Junyeong was bothered by the way she was obsessed with his appearance. Even Beomjin had asked her if she was worried Sungun would be concerned about her hair. Did he also think she liked him? Hyesu mistook her silence for gloom and advised her to just admit that she liked Sungun. She walked up to Junyeong and poked her in the chest. Then she whispered and said she knew why it actually felt difficult for Junyeong to express her feelings. Her voice went low and dark as she said the next words. Hyesu said she didn't blame Junyeong for the way her mother was. Junyeong was shell-shocked. This bratty girl knew her secret. Hyesu promised not to gossip about her mother, even if she loved gossiping. Junyeong tried to pretend she had no clue what Hyesu was talking about. While all this was going on, Sungun approached the girls from behind. He called out to them and said hello. Hyesu waved back to him with a silly cheeriness in her voice. Seunggun ignored her and went over to Junyeong to ask if she was feeling all right. She kept silent and he asked again. Hyesu flashed Junyeong a mocking smirk. Seunggun was about to offer her some help if she still had a cold, but she didn't let him finish and reminded him to mind her business. Seunggun recoiled in shock. Junyeong gave him no time to recover or react as she walked away with her head down. She clenched her fists by her sides in anger as she walked, stopping in her tracks only when she spotted Beomjin up ahead. The both of them stared at each other with a hint of hesitation on their faces. Their pact must have been running through their minds. Junyeong eventually walked away without saying a word to him. Beomjin stared at her retreating figure in silence. Much later in the school day, Junyeong was in a class, and as she wrote in her notebook, she couldn't help but think about Hyesu's words from earlier. She wondered what Hyesu knew about her mother. Unlike most other mothers, Junyeong knew hers wasn't normal. Even though she'd lived with her in the same house the whole time, there was very little she knew about her mother. All she knew was that her mother could talk much and was always in pain. Always. That was why she always had to lash out at Junyeong violently every single day. Junyeong had a memory, however hazy as it was, about trying to speak with her mother as a little girl. As little as she was, she'd wondered what went on in her mother's head. At some point, she'd been so worried about her sick mother who still went to work every now and then. But after she'd suffered abuse after abuse from her mother every day when she returned from work, she slowly began to care less as she wiped her urine off the floor. Junyeong and her mother were poor, but she could bet that no one else had experienced poverty as hard as it had broken her. Junyoung's mother was suffering from a very deep pain, and she feared it was eating away at her body and mind. Junyeong could still hear the grunts and groaning from her mother as she cleaned the room where she stayed. But presuming that her mother's illness was the reason for her attitude hadn't done much to comfort. Recently, she'd noticed that her mother had started leaving money in the corner of the house. When Junyeong asked her if she could take the money, her mother's response was always the same. Silence. Even when Junyeong bought books with the money, her mother didn't say anything. Junyeong just converted the money her mother left out to her allowance. She didn't really care where the money was coming from. All she could think about was how she had to be the best at everything she did. She owed it to herself to get a better life than she could afford with her family. And no matter what she did, it wasn't her fault that her mother didn't raise her to be less miserable than she was. All these thoughts came to her mind as she idly doodled on her notebook in class, but she froze as she wondered what her mother did for work. Suddenly, without any warning, the teacher whacked her in the head with a textbook. He'd thought she was sleeping and didn't find it acceptable even if she had very good grades. He asked Junyeong if he looked like a joke to her. Did she assume that simply because she knew how to study on her own, then there was no reason for her to listen in his class? Then he asked if she was ignoring everyone in the class because she thought once she left for Seoul for college, she wouldn't have to see them anymore. Junyeong rolled her eyes mentally at her math teacher. While an outsider would look at him and say, "Oh, how thoughtful of the teacher," Junyeong knew him to be a pervert bastard who was unworthy to be called a teacher. Ever since she'd rejected his offer to join the math club, he'd vowed to make life miserable for her. He held the book close to her head and called her a little brat while advising her to have good character. Such hypocrisy. Junyeong could see his intentions as clearly as day, and so could the other students. It would have been crazy to accept his offer. The piece of trash that he was, her maths teacher, was ready to harass any female student whenever he got the chance. He kept poking the side of her head with the book as he spoke to her, giving unsolicited advice. He said the reason Junyeong couldn't lead other students was because they'd be too scared of her. He claimed to be looking out for her because he was an adult and it was only normal for her to show some respect and listen. He mistook her silence for politeness and submission, but just as he was about to pounce on the opportunity, someone called his attention from behind. He looked over his shoulder with a frown. It was Na Seung-gun. He rose to his feet and explained that Junyeong had fallen sick the previous day and collapsed because of him. He claimed responsibility for her inability to focus in class. He bowed his head in apology, and the math teacher was just confused by the whole scene. He asked why it was Seung-gun's day that Junyeong had been sick. Did she like him so much that she got lovesick? Seung-gun was surprised his teacher would ask a question like that. The math teacher also asked if Junyeong didn't get any sleep the previous night, and Seung-gun could only stutter nervously. Just as they were still speaking, Kwon Beomjin shifted his seat backward, produced a basketball, and launched it into the air, narrowly missing the teacher's head by mere inches. The ball landed on the board with a loud bang and bounced off to the floor. Everyone's attention was fixed on Beomjin. He rose to his feet and accused Seung-gun of throwing the dodgeball at Junyeong the previous day. He insisted that Seung-gun shouldn't have done that and explained that he didn't do it to anyone, even though he was the notorious guy. The math teacher yelled his name angrily, but one look at Kwon Beomjin's emotionless eyes, he reconsidered his actions. Instead, at the end of class, he demanded a letter of apology from each of them by the end of the day. After that, he marched out of the class. Hyesu turned to Seung-gun and asked him why he'd spoken up, because if he hadn't, then he'd have avoided the whole situation. But Seung-gun explained that it was because he was responsible for everything that had happened. He looked over at Junyeong, who'd gone back to her reserved silence like nothing had happened. And for the first time, he considered the possibility that Junyeong and Beomjin were a couple. Hyesu didn't catch his unfinished statement, so he asked her to forget about it and brushed it off. He sat back in his seat and began scribbling on his notebook while he thought about Junyeong's warming to mind his business. Was that why he'd become more concerned about her? Because she'd told him off? Seung-gun considered it briefly before drawing a conclusion that it couldn't be the reason. He'd always been concerned about her from the beginning. Later in class, while Junyeong was still writing her letter of apology, Beomjin rose from his seat and hung his bag on his shoulder. From the corner of her eyes, she kept watching him as she wondered if he'd finished writing his own letter already. He picked up the piece of paper from the desk, and when glanced at it, there was nothing written on it. But Kwon Beomjin, being who he was, there was just no way he'd get into trouble for turning it in as it was. The math teacher would assume Beomjin was asking for a fight with a gesture like that. Junyeong already knew he'd get punished in some horrible way or the other for breaking a school rule, especially because the maths teacher still taught other people as well. Junyeong carried on in silence, writing her letter of apology as she reflected on the incident from the math class. She'd never imagined that Kwon Beomjin was the kind of person to stand up for someone. She kept her eyes on him as he walked out of the classroom. She could feel the heat of multiple gazes stealing secret glances at her. She could hear their gossip about her and Kwon Beomjin, but she chose to ignore all of it anyway. She rose to her feet and packed up her things. Junyeong knew it was only normal for her classmates to have their suspicions. Kwon Beomjin had interfered in her issue for the second time, and he was known for sleeping most of the time. And this time, he'd been more direct. Junyeong couldn't help but admit that she liked her relationship with Kwon Beomjin. Theirs was a friendship that no one knew about. As she walked out of the class, she thought about how no one would ever joke with her again, knowing she was affiliated with Beomjin. She paused as she stepped out into the corridor and caught a glimpse of Beomjin's back. If their relationship fell apart, then she'd be to blame. She called out to him and asked him to give her his apology letter. She could see the surprise on his face at her approach. Whatever happened to their pact? But Junyeong was intentional. If he gave the letter to the math teacher the way it did, Beomjin would forever be in the man's bad books, and that wasn't a good place to be. She knew from experience. All around them, heads pressed against windows, some peeked out through the door. Everyone was amazed that Junyeong Yun was speaking with the school's notorious brute, Kwon Beomjin. But Junyeong wasn't prepared for what Beomjin did next. He turned around and began walking away. She shouldn't have been surprised anyway, because it was his normal attitude. But she wasn't ready to back down. She asked him to wait and chased after him. As she reached out to grab his arm, he violently swatted her hands away, and Junyeong was left surprised. Then he turned around slowly, his eyes empty of whatever understanding they'd developed in the abandoned house as he asked her who she thought she was. Junyeong stared at him in confusion. The corridor was abuzz with murmurs and gossiping. Hisu was the most amused of all. She figured that Junyeong was the only one who was under the impression that Beomjin was her friend. They couldn't have been friends with the death stare Beomjin was giving her. Then, out of nowhere, Seunggun walked up to the scene and offered to teach Kwon Beomjin how to write an apology letter if he didn't know how to write one. Seunggun stood in the awkward silence that was growing around them like a wall, certainly regretting his move, especially with the stare he got from Beomjin. But Beomjin, nonchalant as always, turned around like no one had spoken and began walking away. The corridor emptied almost immediately. Seunggun swallowed the embarrassment as it threatened to choke him, and he admitted he had no right to talk because he hadn't written his own letter yet. Then he turned to Junyeong and asked her if she'd written hers, and she answered nope. He scratched his neck and confessed that he hadn't done his own either. He didn't even know where to start from. Junyeong looked at him and reasoned that she'd never asked him to step in. And now it was her fault that he was acting the way he was. Then, as if reading from a textbook, Junyeong began reciting the lines to the most convincing apology letter ever. When she was done, Seunggun was left astounded. He was surprised because she'd told him she'd never written an apology letter before. But Junyeong casually brushed off his advice and asked him to write his own letter just as she'd recited. Seunggun didn't quite think the letter would be convincing if he just wrote word for word like she'd recited. He thought it would sound fake and sarcastic. Junyeong told him it'd sound convincing because it was from him, not Seunggun. She turned away to leave, but he called her back. When she paused to hear him, he asked if he'd done something wrong. Junyeong didn't have the answer to that. On her way out of the school premises, Junyeong spotted Beomjin, but they didn't walk back together. Junyeong thought to herself if Beomjin was capable of thinking about something as complicated as their situation in school. She made up her mind not to ask him too many questions, because knowing what was on his mind was not as important as studying, especially since the exams were not far away. As she approached the abandoned house, she wondered for a moment what would happen if Beomjin wasn't inside. She knew she shouldn't be going back home in the dark, but she also dreaded having to sleep in the house again. But in the end, she really didn't mind because it was way better than staying with her mother. Her mind flashed back to what Oh Hee-soo told her in school that morning. Junyeong was aware that the girl hated her, but she'd never have guessed it was enough to make her say the things she'd said. It had to be about Na Seunggun. She figured it was best she kept her distance from Seunggun for both their sakes, and she also resolved to try and have a proper conversation with her mother. Her head felt heavy with too many thoughts. When she got to the door, she noticed it was unlocked already. Beomjin was already asleep. Didn't he ever get tired of sleeping all day? As she brought her hand to the knob to let herself in, she paused in realization. A silly little plan was forming in her head. Junyeong quietly let herself into the house, tiptoeing up the steps of the bunk on the second floor. She was up to some mischief, all right. She wanted to see Kwon Beomjin bang his head in the ceiling again as revenge for swatting her hand away back in school. He was sleeping just as she'd thought. As Junyeong jumped on the bed to startle Beomjin, she received the surprise of her life. Instead of jumping to the ceiling and banging his head like the last time, he quickly turned around on the bed and pulled her under his body. His hand pressed hard against her neck and Junyeong was shaking with fear. Beomjin looked down at her startled face with confusion written all over his. Once he realized she was the one, he quickly backed away and began apologizing. He asked if she was okay through a round of coughing from her. Junyeong was still shaken, and in her state, she demanded to know what he thought he was doing. Beomjin gently explained that he'd heard very light footsteps, so he'd assumed a weirdo had made it into the house. Then he asked her why she'd try playing tricks on him because it totally freaked him out. Junyeong wasn't near repentance. She asked him how normal it was for a person freaking out to choke another person. She'd almost died. Kwon Beomjin apologized again and asked her if she was okay. Junyeong rubbed her neck and asked for some water. Beomjin quickly darted down the steps and Junyeong was instantly stunned and worried for him. She asked him to turn on the lights if he was going to dash down the steps like that. Beomjin turned the lights on and brought her some water to drink, which she accepted with a cold glare, of course. As Junyeong looked at him, she couldn't help but conclude that he was a totally different person than when he was at school. As Junyeong drank the water, Beomjin told her not to worry about him falling down the stairs because he'd sooner die from suffocation than falling. Then he apologized again before telling her not to play pranks on him again. Junyeong chose to be petty about the situation and asked why it was cool for him to strangle her, but she couldn't play a little joke on him. This wasn't her fault. No, she wasn't prepared to take the blame for it. Beomjin explained that they weren't the same and Junyeong demanded an explanation. Beomjin gave it some thought before he answered and said he was more athletic. This seemed to trigger Junyeong and she immediately launched her leg at him in an attempt to kick him, but she ended up clutching her leg in pain as she wondered if he was built from rocks. Junyeong asked him why he did it. He was confused and asked what she was talking about. Junyeong was talking about the basketball back in math class. Beomjin said he had bad sleeping habits, but Junyeong didn't need a lie detector to know he was a terrible liar. She asked him how come she'd never seen that terrible sleeping habit of his when she'd been seeing him sleeping more than anything else. Then Beomjin explained that it usually happened sometimes when he had a nightmare. Junyeong was surprised to learn that someone like him could have nightmares. Be actually scared of something. He answered yeah, and looked away before confessing that his nightmares were the reason he was always in the abandoned house. Junyeong looked at him in surprise as she recalled that he'd once mentioned something about it in the past. Beomjin cut through her thoughts and asked why she'd come straight to the house instead of going back home after spending the night away. Junyeong couldn't give him a straight answer right away. Beomjin asked her if she really liked studying so much. Junyeong figured he had a point. What had made her so curious to come up to the house instead of going home? Rather than give him full details, she gave him answers that weren't entirely false. She did love studying. She had no other choice because that was the only thing going her way at the moment. She kept her gaze away from Beomjin's without offering any more explanation. Then she rose on the bed and asked him to write his apology letter to the math teacher, because he was really stubborn and didn't ever let matters slide. As she walked down the stairs to the first floor, Beomjin called out after her and asked if she'd had fun writing hers with Seunggun. Junyeong froze on the spot and turned to ask him what he was talking about and why he'd assumed she got along well with Seunggun. Beomjin casually mulled over her questions without a response. Junyeong asked him to stop bringing Seunggun up. She got down to the first floor and looked up at the second floor. She asked Beomjin if he'd slept and he answered yeah. She ducked her teeth in irritation and turned back to her books. She stayed studying, losing track of time until it began getting dark outside. Much later, when it had gotten dark outside, Beomjin led her through the mountain path in their usual fashion. She'd stayed later than usual, trying to memorize the English vocab words she'd procrastinated on. They walked in silence as usual, until Beomjin suddenly stopped. Junyeong asked what the matter was, and he made her realize that the street lights were off. He asked her how far her house was from where they were, and Junyeong quickly told him that she could go home by herself. Then she jokingly asked if he was worried about her because he was feeling sorry for choking her earlier. As if triggered, his face went all mean again, and Junyeong rolled her eyes. All she just had to do was say something like she just had, and he'd become angry-looking. She told him her house wasn't far, and that the street was empty, so there was nothing to be afraid of. Beomjin casually looked up in the distance and told her there was someone up ahead. Junyeong was alarmed and asked where the person was. Left without a choice, she considered taking up Beomjin's offer to walk her all the way to her house. but she flipped the script so it wouldn't look like she was asking for him to walk her home. She asked him to walk her to the front door since he was so worried about her. She watched his lips curl at the corners with a smirk. They walked down the street together in the dark, their steps echoing in the air around them. As they approached a corner, Junyeong froze in recognition. Beomjin had been right. There was someone just up ahead and they looked really familiar. Her mother! Junyeong abandoned the stick and dashed towards her mother. Beomjin quickly hid the stick behind him. Junyeong got to her mother and asked her what she was doing outside before offering to take her back home. While she was still speaking, her mother's eyes went sickeningly wide and she lifted her hand to slap Junyeong. The slap resounded through the empty street and froze Junyeong momentarily. While she was still nursing the sharp sting of her mother's slap, more rained on, landing on different parts of her body. The onslaught of attacks sent her crashing into the wall behind her and she slid down to the ground. Her mother paused and held her head as she let out a gurgling scream. Junyeong was still reeling from the shock and pain burning on her face. She was momentarily disoriented. From the corner of her eyes, she spotted Beomjin's silhouette in the corner. He'd witnessed everything. He knew everything now. Her greatest weakness. She'd done so well to keep it a secret, but it just couldn't stay that way. The slaps resumed and she held her arms up to protect herself from her mother's attacks. But before the next slap landed, Beomjin had closed the gap and threw himself over her like a human shield. Junyeong was surprised by the gesture as a little sigh of discomfort escaped from Beomjin's lips. And that's where we'll pause today. The title of the manhwa is Just Twilight. And in today's recap, we covered up to chapter 10. If you'd like to see what happens next, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thank you so much for your support. Until next time.